Hello and welcome to my channel, I Want to Lose Gaming. Ever since the release of Ganyu the Goat, much of the community has been clamoring for her rerun. In this video, I'll be presenting over 20 things to consider for Ganyu's long-awaited rerun. Ganyu was released all the way back on January 12th, 2021. That's right, it's going to be an entire year since her release for her to finally get her rerun in the second half of patch 2.4. Even an entire year later, Ganyu is still regarded to be one of the best DPS characters in the game, with many arguing that she is still the best DPS character in the game. But really quick, it's time to pay some bills, and today's sponsor is 33RD Random Defense. Get ready for one of the most challenging RPG tower defense games on the market. 33RD Random Defense lives up to its random name since it randomly deploys both enemy monsters and your random animal defenders. If you're an old school gamer like me, you may remember this as an OG custom StarCraft 1 map. Your animal defenders use pistols, rifles, and even weird weapons like slingshots and hairdryers. Expand your knowledge to figure out what are the best weapons to attack the monsters with. And now is the perfect time to start playing because of the brand new anniversary event, which has limited edition Christmas skins and a brand new game mode. 33RD puts a spin on the usual tower defense formula of stopping monsters moving from point A to point B, and instead, it's about keeping the number of monsters doing laps to 33 or under. There are perfect game modes whether you only have a few minutes to play or if you've got some time to kill. Single player mode and duel matches end in less than 3 minutes, whereas when you play co-op with friends, it can take up to 20 minutes to beat the hardest content in the game. And finally, 33RD is one of the most free-to-play friendly mobile games on the market, as you're able to unlock the best teams simply by playing the game. So what are you waiting for? Smash that link down in the description below to get started with 33RD Random Defense. Anyway, let's dive into her strengths and weaknesses. The first and foremost thing that most people know about Ganyu is that she relies on her overpowered charge shots. Now, if you want to use Ganyu as a main DPS, you need to be completely comfortable with using and abusing charge shots to bring out her maximum potential. Ganyu's not for those people that are allergic to aimed mode, and I highly recommend testing her out in her trial run to see if you enjoy using charge shots. It's also important to note that if you get hit and flinch while charging a charge shot, you lose all that time in DPS. You also lose that time in DPS if you're forced to dodge. Also, if you miss your charge shots, you lose damage as well. Both of these things can be overcome with team building and skill, but both of these things are still bound to happen regularly as well. Her level 2 charge shots are great for both single target and AoE scenarios, providing huge multipliers in the process. Because her blooms are so big, it's not as punishing to miss by a bit, as the bloom can hit your target as well. Not only this, but being a charge shot character whose blooms do not lose damage based on distance, she's effectively the only character with infinite range. As such, you're able to sit miles away from your enemies and obliterate them just for fun. And finally, because Ganyu's charge shots are so powerful, depending on her build and team composition, her damage is not gated behind her burst, and her damage also has no cooldown. Unlike almost every other DPS character in the game like Xiao, Raiden, Ito, Hu Tao, Aika, etc., their damage is either behind their burst or behind some kind of cooldown. Now, with all that being said, nowadays her charge shot damage, while good, isn't necessarily the highest in terms of actual DPS. Characters like Hu Tao and Yoimiya have much higher single target DPS, while characters like Xiao and Ito have higher raw damage during their burst. But that's the perfect segue into the next reason as to why Ganyu is so strong. And that reason is that Ganyu is Cryo. Cryo as an element has so many things going for it. You can reverse melt it off of Pyro, and you can freeze with it with Hydro. Let's start with Melt. Remember how I mentioned that Ito and Xiao's raw damage is higher than Ganyu's raw charge shot damage? Well, when you factor in Melt, Ganyu easily matches and often exceeds these characters in terms of damage. And then if you factor in full teams, Ganyu has some of the highest DPS in the game by melting her charge shots. Because Melt uses the 1.5 multiplier and thus the weak side of the Melt reaction, you can melt multiple times off a single Pyro infusion, and thanks to the lack of any internal cooldown on Ganyu's charge shots, she's able to melt 100% of her charge shot damage. This allows for many creative and ridiculously powerful teams where Ganyu literally melts away her enemies. However, Melt is honestly very difficult to play, and is in my opinion one of the hardest playstyles in the game. You need to time your melt reactions with Anemo Pyro infusions as well as Xiangling's Pyronado, all of which can be much trickier than you'd expect, all while managing the energy of your supports and not getting hit. I personally find Melt Ganyu to be one of the most difficult playstyles to use, and I play this game way more than I should. I'll talk more about Melt Ganyu later when I talk about world records and stuff, but let's move on to the next topic. And that topic is that Cryo also provides freeze when paired with Hydro. Freeze capitalizes on the insane 40% crit rate that the Blizzard Strayer set provides, as well as Cryo Resonance, which provides 15% crit rate. Ganyu's first passive, Undividing Heart, provides her with 20% more crit rate for her charge shots after the first charge shot. So this is 75% free crit rate. This allows you to just stack as much crit damage and attack as you possibly can, making gearing her arguably easier but also sometimes more difficult due to overcrit. Not only this, but enemies that are frozen don't attack you, and thus this drastically improves your survivability as well as making it much easier to land your charge shots. And there are so many troublesome enemies that can get frozen, like wolves, robots, specters, and most of the non-boss enemies in the game. I personally like using Freeze as it is the much easier playstyle when compared to Melt. Now let's talk about her abilities, her elemental skill, and her burst. Her elemental skill is a good, quick DPS option and generates 2 to 4 cryo particles, and is arguably the best taunt in the game. Meanwhile, her burst is the best huge AoE cryo applicator in the game. Her burst also does more damage to enemies that are clumped together and also makes her a viable elegy support for a pyro nuker like Hu Tao. So even if you don't use Ganyu for her charge shots, Ganyu can provide some of the best cryo application in the game with her burst. Her burst is also very powerful in freeze comps, as it can permanently apply cryo onto enemies within it for 15 seconds, and it has 100% uptime. Now, not everything is perfect about her burst though, as it has a long casting animation and doesn't necessarily do a ton of damage up front. Now, as for how free-to-play friendly Ganyu is, well, at Constellation 0 she is more than enough to destroy the entire game. However, being the hyper carry that she is, it's highly recommended that you heavily invest into her and farm a great Wanderer set for melts and a great Blizzard Strayer set for freeze. Ganyu also gets a massive boost at Constellation 6, essentially turning her into an outrageous melt nuker, being able to output 2 to 3 meltable charge shots in just a couple of seconds. This can allow her to do around 2 million damage in just, like I said, a few seconds. While Constellation 0 Ganyu is able to handle everything that's not cryo immune with either her freeze build or her melt build, Constellation 6 Ganyu has been destroying world records non-stop since her release. And this is a great opportunity to talk about what things might encourage you to pull for her based on your current account. Ganyu's best weapon for her charge shots is the Amos bow. If you do have the Amos bow, the only character that can really make great use of it is Ganyu. Ganyu is great for freeze teams, but freeze teams love their 5-star characters. Either Mona or Kokomi is highly recommended as the Hydro applicator for a freeze team. If you want to play freeze and don't have Mona or Kokomi, you may want to reassess your approach. Also, Venti or Kazuha are highly recommended as well. And finally, the 4th slot often goes to Ayaka to have a double cryo DPS core on your freeze team. Ganyu's melt team is less dependent on having so many 5-stars though, since Bennett and Xiangling are usually on the melt team. The 4th slot is more flexible, and Kazuha or Sucrose or even Zhongli all function very well here. Unfortunately, Ganyu's melt team is massively boosted by her Constellation 6, allowing you to do much more damage much more quickly and thus, front load her melt damage. And last but not least, I always have to talk about the absolute peak performance of said character. I'm talking about whale setups here, but I think it's still valuable knowledge. Unlike Xiao, as an example here, since Xiao is also being reran in patch 2.4, Ganyu has been crushing leaderboards ever since her release. In particular, Ganyu is exceptional at continuous Abyss 12 runs. Although this category has been defunct as of late due to the downtime of the Spiral Abyss leaderboards, while it was up, Ganyu won many a competition for continuous Abyss 12 runs. Ganyu is extremely well represented by some of the best players in Genshin Impact, and I highly recommend checking out a list, as well as some CN Genshin speedrunners if you're interested. However, for single chamber clears in Abyss 12, Ganyu usually isn't the best option for this, as explosive nukers like Hu Tao, Raiden, and Eula can one-shot waves with less setup. and nowadays there are many competitive team comps to Ganyu. Nonetheless, Ganyu's lack of reliance on her burst allows her team to only focus on their own energy problems, which solves a lot of issues that many teams have in continuous Abyss 12 runs. And before wrapping up, please do smash today's sponsors link down in the description below, as that helps my channel so much, as well as our sponsor 33RD Random Defense. Anyway, to summarize for Ganyu, her strengths are as follows. She is still considered to be arguably the best DPS in the game, both at Constellation 0 and at Constellation 6. She has the best charge shot in the entire game. She is great for single targets and multiple targets. Ganyu is the only character with infinite range, but this is mostly just for fun and not usually that practical. Ganyu is not burst dependent to output her charge shot damage, and Ganyu has no cooldown on her charge shot damage. Ganyu has two meta teams, Melt and Freeze, which both use completely different sets of supports, and thus allows Ganyu to be very flexible. Melt has one of the highest damage outputs in the entire game, and Melt has a very high skill ceiling and skill expression if you're into that type of thing. Freeze trivializes difficulty by freezing the enemy, and the Freeze build can provide her up to 75% free crit rate. Ganyu also arguably has the best taunt in the game, which also generates 2 to 4 cryo particles. Ganyu's burst has 100% uptime and is one of the best AoE cryo applicators in the game. Her burst also does a ton of damage to clustered enemies, and her burst can allow Ganyu to be played in a more support role, usually for supporting Hu Tao with the elegy for the end, thus allowing Hu Tao to do a huge melt. Ganyu at Constellation 0 is able to handle everything besides cryo-resistant enemies, and Ganyu has decent free-to-play options in the Prototype Crescent and Hamayumi. Ganyu's Constellation 6 is broken and is one of the best constellations in the game, and finally Ganyu has been smashing world records ever since her release and even today. Now let's talk about her weaknesses. If you're on mobile and find aiming difficult, you may want to avoid her. If Ganyu gets interrupted while charging a charge shot, she loses a lot of damage. Her raw unbuffed damage output isn't necessarily amazing by today's standards, although it is still really good. Her elemental skill has a long 10-second cooldown, and Melt is very difficult to play in my opinion. Ganyu's Constellation 6 makes a huge difference for her, which is worth keeping in mind. And while a Freeze build is very comfy to play, Freeze doesn't necessarily have the highest DPS, although perhaps Shenhe can help, but we'll just have to wait and see. Freeze prefers having a lot of 5-star characters like Mona or Kokomi, Venti or Kazuha, and Ayaka, and maybe even Shenhe. If Shenhe is a top pick for Ganyu, which is unknown as of today, then that's a lot of primo gems in a single patch to get both Shenhe and Ganyu. So yeah, Ganyu has aged incredibly well in the Genshin Impact meta, and frankly, I don't see her going anywhere in terms of her power level for a long time. I will say this though, miHoYo has done an amazing job at not power creeping Ganyu, as even a year later, Ganyu is still heralded as one of the best characters in the game. The day that Ganyu is no longer considered to be one of the best characters in the game will be a dark day not just for Ganyu, but for literally every other DPS character in the game. Let me know what you think about the points I've made in this video, and if you plan to pull for Ganyu when she comes back in patch 2.4. Another tip, I highly recommend paying close attention to Shenhe as well. If you're interested in Ganyu, as Shenhe could be a really interesting teammate for Ganyu. Also, I regularly make Genshin Impact videos, ranging from Caesar showcases, DPS showdowns, guide videos, and more. So be sure to smash the subscribe button, as it's the best and easiest way for you to support my work. Also, don't forget to like the video and leave a comment for the YouTube algorithm. As always, I appreciate every single one of you. This is I Want to Lose, signing out.